Ever wonder what it was really like to stand on a medieval battlefield? Armor on, sword in hand, and the stench of war all around you? Forget the fairy tales. Being a medieval soldier wasn't just about honor and glory. It was blood, sweat, hunger, fear, and if you were lucky, survival. In today's video, we're diving deep into the brutal, fascinating, and often overlooked reality of life as a medieval warrior. Number 1. Campaign season. In medieval Europe, war was never just about swords and shields. It was also about timing. Battles weren't fought year-round like modern conflicts. Instead, there was something known as campaign season, which largely followed the rhythm of the agricultural calendar. This season typically began in the spring, right after peasants had sown their crops, and wrapped up before the autumn harvest. Most medieval armies were made up of men who were also farmers. If they didn't plant or harvest, their families could starve, and lords wouldn't collect their dues. So, campaign season was structured to avoid disrupting the basic economic engine of medieval life: agriculture. Spring and summer offered better roads and easier movement. Back then, there weren't paved highways, just dirt paths, which turned to mud in the rain and snow. Once winter ended and the ground dried out, it was finally possible to move carts, siege equipment, and cavalry without getting stuck. That's why military campaigns were usually launched around April or May. It wasn't just about strategy or politics, yes, it was about mud. And since armies traveled with huge baggage trains full of food, weapons, and supplies, dry conditions mattered a lot. Another big reason for seasonal warfare was food. Summer meant more available resources: grain for bread, grass for horses, wild game in the forests. When you're feeding hundreds or thousands of men, food becomes a serious logistical issue. Armies often brought some supplies with them, but they also relied heavily on foraging, requisitioning from villages, or straight-up looting. In the warmer months, there was simply more to take: ripening crops, livestock in the fields, and rivers that weren't frozen solid. It was easier to keep an army alive, mobile, and in fighting shape. That said, not everything about campaign season was convenient. Because armies were usually active only for a few months, lords had to make the most of that time. This created pressure to fight quickly and decisively. There wasn't much room for prolonged battles or long-term sieges unless absolutely necessary. Still, some campaigns did stretch into the colder months. When that happened, things got brutal. Winter warfare meant freezing tents, dying horses, and disease spreading through cold, damp camps. Sieges that lasted into fall or winter were particularly tough for both attackers and defenders. One of the most famous examples of campaign season planning was William the Conqueror's 1066 invasion of England. He gathered his troops during the summer, but they couldn't cross the English Channel immediately due to bad winds. By the time they finally landed in England, Harold Godwinson, the English king, had already fought off another invasion in the north and rushed his tired army south. The timing of that campaign meant when each army moved and when they had to go home for the harvest, played a huge role in who won the crown of England. Number 2, family on the march. In the Middle Ages, going to war wasn't always a solitary affair for soldiers. While we often imagine medieval campaigns as strictly male, military-only endeavors, the reality was much more complex. In fact, it was fairly common for soldiers to bring their families with them on campaign. Wives, children, and even elderly parents could be seen marching behind the army or living in temporary camps near the battlefield. These families weren't just there for emotional support. They played a crucial role in keeping the army functioning on a day-to-day basis. Wives of soldiers often took on essential duties that helped sustain the army. Cooking meals, repairing clothing, washing laundry, tending fires, and even caring for the wounded became part of their daily routine. In the absence of a formal logistics corps, these camp followers filled the gaps that the army itself couldn't cover. Soldiers were responsible for fighting, but without clean clothes, warm meals, or basic medical attention, morale and efficiency would quickly collapse. Camp followers became the army's unofficial supply line, health service, and domestic infrastructure all rolled into one. Children who accompanied their parents learned to adapt quickly to the hardships of campaign life. Older children might help with simple chores, gathering firewood, fetching water, or assisting with cooking. The presence of children might seem odd on a battlefield, but medieval society was deeply accustomed to hardship and mobility. Life expectancy was lower, and people grew up faster. For many, it was normal to be exposed to danger and conflict from an early age. Not all family members were there by choice, however. Sometimes the family followed out of necessity, especially for those from lower social classes. They couldn't afford to be left behind without support. There was no welfare system. Soldiers' pay might be the only income available to the household. Staying together, even in a war zone, often made more sense economically and socially than being separated for months or years on end. That said, bringing the family along wasn't without significant risks. Camps were vulnerable to disease outbreaks, especially dysentery and typhus. Sanitation was minimal, and close quarters made it easy for illness to spread. If the army was ambushed or defeated, non-combatants could be caught in the crossfire or targeted by looters. In some campaigns, like the ill-fated People's Crusade, thousands of civilian followers were massacred during surprise attacks. Families became not only a logistical challenge, but also a moral burden. Soldiers often had to choose between protecting their loved ones and carrying out orders in battle. Aristocratic women sometimes joined their husbands on campaign too, though their role was quite different. Noblewomen might travel with a retinue of servants, and their presence could have political implications, used to solidify alliances, oversee household affairs, or even serve as diplomatic envoys. Queens occasionally accompanied kings on major crusades or military expeditions, though they usually stayed far from the front lines. In essence, medieval military life extended far beyond just the soldier. Family members transformed campaigns into traveling communities with their own rhythms, responsibilities, and routines. Their presence was both a source of strength and vulnerability, and while largely invisible in official military records, they were absolutely essential to how armies operated on the move. Number 3. Training and preparation. In the Middle Ages, formal military training wasn't widely available, especially for common soldiers. Most people learned how to fight through their everyday lives. Hunting was a big part of this. It wasn't just about putting food on the table, it was a way to develop essential combat skills like archery, stealth, and tracking. Riding horses through rough terrain also helped young men get comfortable with horseback riding, which was a crucial skill for many types of medieval warfare. For the nobility, the path to becoming a soldier, especially a knight, was more structured. Boys usually started their training around the age of 7. They'd be sent off to another noble family to serve as a page. As pages, they learned basic swordplay, horse care, manners, and religious instruction. Around age 14, a page became a squire. Squires trained under the guidance of an experienced knight. This stage involved hands-on weapons training, helping their knight in battle, and learning the responsibilities of knighthood. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about discipline, honor, and obedience. Physical preparation was intense. Soldiers often trained with wooden weapons that were much heavier than real ones. This built up strength and made actual weapons feel easier to handle. They marched long distances carrying heavy gear, which got them ready for the physical demands of war. Activities like wrestling, swimming, and climbing were used to boost endurance, balance, and coordination. Manual labor like chopping wood or working the land also contributed to their physical fitness, especially for those from the lower classes who didn't have access to training grounds. Tournaments were another form of training, mostly for the upper class. These were public events where knights tested their skills in mock battles or jousts. They were dangerous, but they gave knights a chance to gain reputation, build confidence, and sharpen their combat instincts in a relatively controlled environment. Common soldiers didn't usually have access to such events, so they relied on practice with whatever they had. Village games often turned into friendly sparring matches, and local militias drilled occasionally. Some lords organized group training sessions before campaigns, focusing on basic formations, handling weapons, and coordinated movement. Number 4, weapons and armor. In the medieval world, a soldier's gear said a lot about who they were and how well they were doing financially. The difference between a knight's armor and what a common foot soldier wore was often massive, not just in quality, but also in cost and overall effectiveness. Knights, who were usually from noble families, could afford the best protection available. Early on, this meant chainmail, also known as mail hauberks, made of thousands of interlinked metal rings. It was flexible and decent against slashing attacks, but not great against blunt force. By the 14th and 15th centuries, wealthier knights started switching to full-plate armor. These suits were crafted from shaped metal plates and offered much better protection against arrows, swords, and other weapons. Despite the popular image, they weren't impossibly heavy or clunky. A full suit weighed around 45 to 60 pounds and was designed to distribute weight evenly so knights could still move fairly freely. Along with their armor, knights typically carried swords for close combat, lances for mounted charges, and large shields, usually kite or heater-shaped, for added defense. Meanwhile, foot soldiers had to make do with much simpler and cheaper equipment. Many wore padded garments like gambesons, thick jackets stuffed with wool or rags that offered decent protection on a budget. Some had bits of chainmail or metal plates sewn into their clothing, depending on what they could afford or loot. Their weapons were practical and often easy to produce. Spears were popular due to their reach and effectiveness against cavalry. Bows and crossbows gave infantry a ranged advantage, especially the longbow in English armies, which could pierce even plate armor at the right angle. Other common weapons included short swords, axes, and maces, tools that were also useful off the battlefield. Weapon design evolved with battlefield needs. Blunt weapons like maces and warhammers became more common as plate armor improved, since they could damage internal organs through armor even without penetration. Pole arms like halberds and pikes were used to keep horsemen at bay or disrupt enemy formations. Number 5. Life in camp. Life in a medieval military camp was a mix of routine maintenance, camaraderie, and constant readiness for battle. These camps were temporary but essential hubs of activity, functioning as both the logistical heart of the army and the home base for soldiers between fights. While they offered relative safety compared to the battlefield, daily life in camp came with its own set of challenges. The first priority for soldiers in camp was upkeep. Weapons and armor required regular attention. Rust had to be cleaned off, edges sharpened, straps repaired, and arrows restocked. A soldier's survival often depended on how well they maintained their gear. Blacksmiths and armorers were a crucial part of the camp's workforce, setting up mobile forges to mend damaged equipment and create new parts when needed. Horses, especially for knights and mounted troops, demanded constant care. Feeding, grooming, and treating injuries were everyday tasks, usually carried out by squires or lower-ranking soldiers. Horses were expensive assets, and losing one to neglect could severely impact a soldier's role in the next battle. Food preparation was another daily concern. Soldiers usually brought preserved rations with them, like dried meats, grains, or hard bread, but they also foraged or bought supplies locally when possible. Communal cooking fires were common, and meals were often simple stews made from whatever ingredients were available. Poor sanitation and spoiled food, however, led to frequent illness. Clean drinking water was a major issue, and contaminated water supplies could quickly spread disease through the camp. When duties were done, downtime in camp varied from quiet to rowdy. Storytelling, singing, and playing instruments helped pass the time, while gambling, dice games, and drinking were favorite distractions among the ranks. These moments of relaxation helped maintain morale, but they could also lead to disputes and discipline problems, especially in larger or more mixed groups. Despite the lively social aspect, life in camp was often rough. Soldiers slept in tents or under makeshift shelters exposed to wind, rain, and cold. Hygiene was basic at best, and the close quarters made it easy for diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and lice infestations to spread. Medical care was primitive, and the wounded were treated with limited tools and knowledge. Number 6. Sieges and warfare. Siege warfare was one of the defining strategies of medieval military conflict. Unlike open field battles, which were often over in a matter of hours or days, sieges could stretch on for weeks or even months, turning warfare into a brutal game of patience, strategy, and survival. When attacking armies set their sights on a fortified castle or walled town, their first step was usually to encircle the area, cutting it off from the outside world. No food, no reinforcements, no escape. The goal was to starve the defenders into surrender before having to risk a direct assault. Once a position was surrounded, the attackers began building siege engines, massive wooden machines designed to breach walls and terrify defenders. The most iconic of these was the trebuchet, a giant catapult that could hurl heavy stones with enough force to break through stone fortifications. Other tools included battering rams to smash gates, siege towers to scale walls, and mining tunnels dug underneath the walls to cause them to collapse. These operations took time, manpower, and a lot of engineering know-how. But defending a siege wasn't just about hiding behind thick walls. Castles were often designed with layered defenses, like moats, multiple curtain walls, and towers offering overlapping fields of fire. Archers positioned on the ramparts would rain arrows down on the enemy, while defenders poured boiling oil or threw rocks on troops trying to climb the walls. Inside the fortress, defenders rationed food, reinforced weak spots, and sometimes launched surprise sorties to destroy siege weapons or harass the enemy camp. Conditions during a siege were miserable for both sides. Disease ran rampant due to poor sanitation, rotting corpses, and contaminated water. Starvation became a constant threat. In prolonged sieges, people inside the castle might be forced to eat animals, leather, or even corpses. Outside the walls, the besieging army also had to contend with hunger, exposure, and boredom. If a siege dragged on too long, morale dropped, desertion increased, and commanders had to worry about enemy reinforcements. Despite all this suffering, sieges were often seen as preferable to frontal assaults. Storming a fortified position was incredibly dangerous and costly, so commanders would only attempt it if they were confident the enemy was weak, or they had breached the defenses enough to make it worth the risk. In some cases, defenders surrendered before bloodshed began, hoping to negotiate terms that spared lives, though not always successfully. Number 7. Communication and morale. In the chaos of medieval battlefields, effective communication could mean the difference between victory and a complete rout. Unlike modern armies with radios and structured chains of command, medieval commanders had to rely on more primitive but strategic tools to relay orders and maintain cohesion. One of the most commonly used methods was visual signaling. Flags, banners, and standards were not only symbols of noble houses, but also functioned as rallying points and indicators of tactical shifts. A raised banner might signal a charge, a retreat, or a regrouping maneuver. Each knight or unit typically followed their lord's banner, so its movement was essential for coordination. Messengers on horseback also played a key role in battlefield communication. These individuals carried verbal commands or written messages, often risking their lives crossing dangerous terrain to reach other parts of the army. However, this method came with delays and the constant risk that the messenger could be killed or captured. To improve communication across large forces, commanders occasionally used trumpets, drums, or horns. These instruments had distinct sounds associated with specific actions, allowing troops to recognize orders even in the noise and confusion of battle. But communication wasn't just tactical, it was emotional and spiritual. Morale was a battlefield asset as valuable as any weapon. Commanders knew that a motivated army could hold a line or press forward even in desperate conditions. Speeches given before a battle served to unite the soldiers, reminding them of what they were fighting for, be it loyalty to their lord, defense of their homeland, or glory in the eyes of God. These speeches were often passionate and theatrical, filled with promises of honor, loot, or divine reward. Religion was deeply embedded in the military structure. Many soldiers believed that the outcome of a battle was determined by God's will. This belief shaped their mental resilience. The presence of chaplains or priests in military camps wasn't just ceremonial. They blessed troops, heard confessions, and led prayers before combat. Holy relics were sometimes carried into battle, serving as symbols of divine protection. Soldiers might wear crosses or other religious tokens for luck and protection. For many, fighting wasn't just a duty, it was a sacred mission. Number 8. The aftermath of battle. Surviving a medieval battle was only the beginning of a new set of challenges. Even if a soldier made it through the fighting alive, serious danger still loomed. The most immediate concern was dealing with injuries. Medical knowledge during the Middle Ages was extremely limited, and battlefield medicine was often brutal, rushed, and based on outdated theories. Open wounds were rarely treated with any real understanding of infection or sanitation. The idea of bacteria didn't exist yet, and antiseptics were unknown. If a wound didn't kill a soldier right away, infection often did the job later. Soldiers might have their wounds cauterized with hot metal to stop bleeding or have limbs amputated without any form of anesthesia. Just grit, maybe a stiff drink, and a lot of screaming. Beyond physical trauma, there were the psychological effects. Medieval soldiers didn't have any concept of PTSD, but surviving brutal combat and watching friends die in close quarters definitely left its mark. Returning to everyday life wasn't always possible or even desirable for many veterans, especially if they were maimed or too injured to work. Some would remain with the army as camp helpers or guards, but others had to beg or rely on church charity to survive. Then there were the prisoners. Capturing enemies could be more profitable than killing them, especially if the prisoner was a noble or someone with connections. High-ranking individuals were often held for ransom, and the sums could be significant. Entire battles sometimes ended with key figures being captured and traded like chess pieces in the political game. Lower-ranking prisoners, though, weren't so lucky. If they were considered a burden or posed a risk, they might be executed or enslaved. Looting was another major part of the post-battle experience. Soldiers were typically allowed to scavenge weapons, armor, money, and anything else of value from the bodies of the fallen or from nearby towns and villages. This wasn't just a perk, it was expected. Looting was one of the few ways poorly paid soldiers could actually profit from their service. In fact, some soldiers signed up for campaigns more for the opportunity to loot than for any sense of duty. Commanders usually turned a blind eye unless it got out of hand or interfered with strategy. Number 9, the role of religion. In the Middle Ages, religion was not just a private belief. It was a force that shaped every aspect of life, including war. For medieval soldiers, going into battle was rarely seen as a purely political or territorial act. More often, it was framed as a fight for God, faith, and the eternal soul. This belief was especially strong during the Crusades, when Christian knights from Europe were told by the Church that, by taking up arms against Muslims in the Holy Land, they were securing not only victory on earth, but salvation in heaven. The Church played a central role in encouraging and justifying warfare. Popes and bishops issued calls to arms, offering spiritual rewards like the forgiveness of sins and guaranteed entrance to heaven for those who died in battle. These promises were not taken lightly. In a deeply religious society where people believed that sin could damn them for eternity, the Church's approval turned warfare into a sacred duty. Fighting for a holy cause became not just an obligation, but an honor. Clergy often traveled with armies. Monks, priests, and bishops didn't just offer moral support, they were active participants. Some, like Bishop Odo of Bayeux, half-brother of William the Conqueror, were even seen wielding weapons and commanding troops on the battlefield. Most, however, focused on conducting mass, hearing confessions, and praying with soldiers before and after combat. They blessed weapons and banners, carried crosses and relics into battle, and reminded warriors that God watched over their every move. This spiritual support was a crucial source of morale. Religious symbols were everywhere in military life. Knights bore crosses on their tunics and shields. Armies marched under banners with saints or depictions of Christ. Holy relics, Items believed to be connected to saints or Jesus himself were carried into combat to invoke divine protection and intimidate the enemy. Some commanders even believed that victories or defeats were direct signs of God's favor or punishment. If they lost a battle, it was often blamed on sin or moral failure, not just strategy. Religion gave medieval warfare a unique psychological edge. It united troops under a common divine cause, offered hope in the face of death, and framed suffering as a path to spiritual reward. For many medieval soldiers, faith wasn't just part of the battle, it was the reason to fight. Number 10. Legacy and memory. The legacy of medieval soldiers has long been shaped by romanticized narratives, legends of noble knights, and heroic last stands. From medieval ballads and epic poems to modern books, films, and games, the image of the brave, chivalrous warrior remains deeply rooted in popular imagination. Characters like King Arthur, Sir Lancelot, and the Knights of the Round Table have become cultural icons, representing ideals of honor, loyalty, and courage. These stories often emphasize valor in battle, loyalty to one's lord or king, and a sense of divine purpose. But beneath the surface of these tales lies a much grittier and more complex reality. The truth is, most medieval soldiers were not knights in shining armor. They were often conscripted peasants, poorly equipped and given minimal training. Unlike the noble classes who could afford high-quality armor and horses, foot soldiers had to make do with padded garments, crude weapons, and the hope that luck would be on their side. Their days were spent marching across muddy terrain, setting up camp in rough conditions, and dealing with hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Battles were chaotic and terrifying, with the very real possibility of death or permanent injury looming over every skirmish. For many soldiers, the motivation to fight had little to do with chivalric codes. Instead, it was often about survival, loyalty to a local lord, or the promise of plunder. War in the Middle Ages could be financially rewarding if you lived through it. Victorious armies frequently looted towns and castles, and soldiers might be rewarded with land or gold. For knights and nobles, capturing an enemy nobleman could lead to a lucrative ransom. These practical aspects of warfare were rarely mentioned in romantic accounts, but played a huge role in the everyday life of a soldier. Despite the hardships, the memory of medieval warfare has been preserved and retold through the lens of myth and legend. This has partly been due to the efforts of chroniclers and poets of the time who were often commissioned by royalty or nobility to write favorable histories. Their work served both as propaganda and as entertainment. Over time, the embellishments became part of the collective memory. By the time of the Renaissance, these stories were already being retold as tales of a lost, golden age of heroism. In modern times, medieval soldiers are often portrayed in video games, movies, and reenactments, where the brutality is sometimes shown but often overshadowed by action and adventure. While these portrayals can spark interest in medieval history, they also tend to oversimplify the experience. A true understanding of what it was like to be a medieval soldier requires looking beyond the armor and swords to the human experience underneath: fear, suffering, camaraderie, and the struggle for survival.